Welcome back to the Strategy YouTube channel. One of my earliest lucky breaks as a YouTube channel when it was just beginning was actually a video made by a different content creator. The channel EDH Deck Building had created a video called Making a Commander Deck That Doesn't Cast Spells. In that video, Demo, the owner of the channel, decided to make a commander deck where you cast as few spells as possible. He uses Derevi as his commander because Derevi doesn't need to be cast to be put onto the battlefield. And in that video, he makes direct reference to the deck that I made with Derevi as a commander, in which I try to pull off a combo that makes it impossible for any players to cast spells for the rest of the game. Watching that video, I felt that Demo did a good job making a deck that was strong and viable while staying as true to the limitations he set for himself as possible, with the caveat that he does actually need to cast a spell in his deck to perform the combo that he designed the deck around. Still, that's incredibly impressive considering the power and performance level he had envisioned for the deck when he made it. That being said, nothing draws my attention more than a janky, weird deck idea, and I started to wonder how viable a deck could be that genuinely casts 0 spells throughout the entire game. Is it even possible to win? Which mechanics or strategies are unavailable to you if you won't cast spells? And so I started brewing and found that it is actually more plausible than you might realize. Choosing the deck's commander was probably the most difficult part. Derevi was off the table, I knew right away. I already have a Derevi deck that's built around not casting spells. Demo has a Derevi deck that's built around not casting spells. It's been overdone. So as much as I love Derevi, I chose to go in a different direction. The other commander that might come to people's minds is Yuriko, the Tiger's Shadow. After all, Yuriko also has an ability that gets around casting and puts your commander from the command zone right onto the battlefield. And truth be told, I was tempted. Blue and black are going to be an incredibly important color combination, as you'll soon see. There ended up being 2 main reasons why I chose not to go with Yuriko as my commander. The first is that Yuriko can't come out of the command zone unless you have an attacking creature. And where am I going to get this attacking creature if I'm not casting spells? There are some ways to get creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield, but that's going to take forever. And the other main problem with Yuriko is that everybody hates her. She's currently one of the strongest commanders in the format. She's a CEDH commander. A lot of players view her as kill on sight. And trust me, with this deck, we need as low a profile as possible. We do not want everyone at the table considering us the #1 threat immediately. There is no shot we survive a 3-person onslaught at the very beginning of the game. Another possibility was to use a commander in the command zone with an eminence ability or some other ability that triggers from the command zone so they don't actually have to come out and be cast onto the battlefield, but I didn't love that idea either. Honestly, I just like to play my commander and have them on the battlefield. It's the reason I play this format and not something like Modern. So having a commander that essentially amounts to passive income and just sits there and gives me a little bit of incremental value wasn't really appealing to me. But then if you don't have a commander that you can get out of the command zone without casting, and you don't have a commander with an ability that just goes off in the command zone, then what difference does it make who you put in the command zone? You're never going to get to play with them anyway, right? Well, not necessarily. There are a few cards in Magic, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that can pull your commander from the command zone to your hand, or even to the battlefield. And you might be surprised by how many ways there are to search for those cards and put them into your hand. All that being said, I decided to lean on a commander that I've had my eye on since they first were revealed in Kaldheim, and that is Narfi, Betrayer King. Narfi buffs our other snow and zombie creatures, but what I really chose him for was that second ability. At any time, we can pay 3 snow mana to return Narfi from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. With this, all we have to do is get Narfi from the command zone to the graveyard, and then we can keep paying that 3 mana to return him from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This way, we don't run a risk of him being sent back to the command zone and having to find another way to get him out again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to see how close I could get this deck to functioning like a standard EDH deck, even though I will never be casting spells. And I also want this deck to be fun to play. So I came up with a quick list of 6 things that I think pretty much every EDH deck has, and tried my best to incorporate all 6 of these things into this deck. The first thing was playing your commander. As I already said, I think you should be able to play with your commander and actually use it on the battlefield, as opposed to having it just sit there. For the second one, I put card advantage. We want our deck to give us access to a greater number of cards as the game continues. For the third one, I put ramp. We want some way to get ahead of the mana curve, or at least stay on par with the rest of the decks at the table when it comes to mana available. For number 4, I put interaction. We want some way to interact with our opponent's boards while also protecting our own stuff from their interaction. For number 5, I put board wipes, more specifically creature board wipes. We want some way to protect ourselves from go wide strategies, or else to remove the creatures on the board if there's there's way too many combo pieces on the battlefield. And for number 6, I put win condition. I want some way to close the game out when we're set up, because creature combat would take forever. We're definitely not going to be winning with creature combat in this deck. Now, full disclosure, we're not going to be consistently curving out with Narfi every game. He's going to be stuck in that command zone until we get something that can get him out of there. Fortunately, we have a couple cards that can help us with this, even without needing to cast them. The most obvious choice and the best one, in my opinion, is Command Beacon. It's a land that we can sacrifice to put Narfi into our hand. Once Narfi is in our hand, all we have to do is discard him and then we're good to go. We could also hit Urza's Cave, which is a land that we can sacrifice to tutor up any other land from our deck and put it directly onto the battlefield tapped. With that, we can go find our Command Beacon and put it on the battlefield, so we'll have it ready next turn. In addition to that, we can also use Urza's Saga. It's going to take a little time, but its last ability allows us to search our library for an artifact card with mana value 0 or 1 and put it on the battlefield. And that gives us a couple options, the first of which is Campfire. It's an artifact that can get Narfi from the command zone into our hand as long as we have 2 mana and we exile it. But if we're missing Campfire, if it got removed or we've already used it or it got milled into our graveyard somehow, that's okay. We also have access to the artifact Expedition map, which we can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice to search our library for a land card and put it into our hand, allowing us to find command zone. So that's 3 lands right there that we could play and eventually get our commander from the command zone into our hand. And there's a couple other ways we can tutor those cards into our hand as well. So it's by no means consistent on curve, but more often than not, eventually we're going to be able to get Narfi online by getting him into our hand and then discarding him. And then, assuming he doesn't get exiled or shuffled away into our library, we can use him as many times as we can pay for it. Now, for card advantage in this deck, the most important thing to keep in mind is that generally milling a card is going to be way better for us than drawing a card. We're not going to be casting any of these spells, so unless they have an activated ability that can be used while they're in the hand, they're essentially worthless there, with one notable exception. On the other hand, there are plenty of cards who, like Narfi, can activate their abilities while in the graveyard. One way that we can consistently get a lot of cards into our graveyard so that we can actually make use of them is with lands that mill yourself. Sequestered Stash is a really good example because it can also return those necessary artifacts from our graveyard to the top of our library. This way, if our Campfire or some other important artifact gets milled away on accident, we can still get it back to the top of our library so that we can have access to it again. Another really strong ability we can take advantage of is Dredge. Cards with Dredge allow you to forego drawing cards in exchange for milling additional cards. And since milling a card is always going to be better than drawing a card in this deck anyway, these cards can be a really powerful lifeline for our deck. One example is Stinkweed Imp. As long as Stinkweed Imp is in our graveyard and we have 7 or more cards in our hand, every turn we can mill 5 cards and return the Stinkweed Imp from our graveyard to our hand. Then at our end step, we can discard down to 7 and discard the Stinkweed Imp again. So next turn we can dredge another 5 cards from the top of our library right into the graveyard. And another great tactic we have access to are those Innistrad creatures that allow you to discard cards from your hand to return them from the graveyard to the battlefield. Not only is this giving us creatures that we can block with or otherwise use to swing at our opponents, but it's also a great way to consistently drop the cards from our hand into the graveyard that we want to be making use of in the graveyard anyway. Keep in mind, to make use of this ability, that card needs to actually be in the graveyard, but if your graveyard is empty and you need one of these cards to get you going, don't be afraid to draw, pass the turn, and discard down to 7 cards. It's okay to miss a land drop if you're getting a Stinkweed Imp or a Haunted Dead into your graveyard so that you can start milling yourself more efficiently. And that leads us into number 3. We're going to need some kind of ramp so that we can keep up, and like each other section on this list, our options are sparse, but we're going to make do with what we've got. First up, we have cards I consider to be barely ramp. Their mana is one-time use, but they work in the confines of the deck we've created, and we're going to take advantage of them. For 3 mana, we can cycle Drownyard Lurker to make an Eldrazi spawn that we can sacrifice later for a mana, and we can pay 2 to exile Halo Scarab from our graveyard to create a treasure token. We just have to remember to be very sparing with this mana and only cash in those tokens when we're about to combo off or when it matters the most. The rest of the ramp in this deck is going to have to come from the land base itself. Drownyard Temple can bring itself back from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and we can use Horizon of Progress to put a different land from our hand onto the battlefield tapped. Talon Gates of Madara is another land we can use, which has an activated ability that can put itself directly onto the battlefield from our hand. As I said, the ramp leaves a lot to be desired, but the bare bones are there, and in this deck we don't actually need that much mana available. After all, we're only going to be activating abilities anyway. We're never going to be casting something for its mana value. Next up, we have Interaction, and like I said, there's not a lot lot, but if we use it wisely, there's just enough to make a difference. Cards like Decree of Silence or Ghostlit Warder can be discarded with their own ability to act as counterspells. This can protect our combo or prevent somebody else from going off in an emergency. We also have ways to protect creatures or give them evasion at instant speed if we're in a pinch. Avian Oddity and Windcaller Avian can both be discarded at instant speed to give a creature flying, which might just enable us to combo off. As far as board wipes in the deck, we don't have a great many, but we have some. Archfiend of Sorrows and Decree of Pain both have a lot of text on them, but all we need to know for this deck is by paying 5 mana at sorcery speed, we can give all creatures our opponents control -2/-2 until end of turn. It's not a Farewell or Cyclonic Rift by any means, but at least it can clear all the goblin tokens off the board if we need to and keep ourselves alive for a couple more turns. For a more lethal board wipe, we can pay 7 mana using Elvish Dreadlord's Encore ability to give all non-elf creatures -9/-9 until end of turn. Non-elf really hurts when our strongest board wipe in our deck doesn't do anything against elf tribal or changeling tribal decks, but at least it'll pretty consistently clear the board out most games. Now we can finally talk about how this deck is going to win the game. This combo has a lot of moving parts and it has a lot of setup, but if you can pull it off, you're definitely going to win the game. Not to mention we aren't technically casting anything, which means traditional counterspells are not going to be able to disrupt this win. To get this combo started, we need to use Covert Technician's Ninjutsu ability to put it onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. When our Covert Technician deals combat damage to a player, we can put an artifact card with mana value less than or equal to that damage from our hand directly onto the battlefield. Neither of these abilities cause anything to be cast, they just put them directly onto the battlefield. So we've hit the opponent for 2 damage, now what? This is where the second part of the combo comes in. You need to have in your hand the card Ashes of the Fallen. It's a 2 mana artifact that when it enters the battlefield allows us to choose a creature type, and then all of the creatures in our graveyard become that type in addition to their other types. So Ashes of the Fallen is going to hit the battlefield and we are going to choose the creature type Sliver. Now we'll finish combat and go into main phase 2. Now the very first thing we're going to do is activate the Unearth ability of Dregscape Sliver. Unearth is an ability that certain creatures have where you can pay a cost to return them from your graveyard to the battlefield with haste, but at the end of the turn they exile themselves. It's also important to remember you can only do this at sorcery speed, so you have to wait until combat is over before doing the rest of this combo. So anyway, we unearth Dregscape Sliver, it enters the battlefield and has haste. But what's most important is its other ability. Each Sliver creature card in our graveyard now has Unearth too. And now because of Ashes of the Fallen, every creature card in our graveyard is a Sliver and they all have Unearth for 2 mana. We're first going to pay 2 colorless mana to put out Leveler using the Unearth ability. Leveler is a 10/10 artifact creature, and when it enters the battlefield it exiles all of the cards remaining in our library. So now our deck should be completely empty, and then we're going to pay 2 colorless mana to return Thassa's Oracle from the graveyard to the battlefield using the Unearth ability. When Thassa's Oracle enters the battlefield, they check the number of cards in our library. If the number of cards is less than the amount of blue mana symbols on permanents we control, we immediately win the game. And because Thassa's Oracle already has at least 2 blue mana symbols and our library has 0 cards, we will automatically win the game as soon as that ability resolves. Let's look at an example of when we're ready to win the game. Here you can see I have the 2 most important cards in my hand, Covert Technician and Ashes of the Fallen, and I have a creature on the battlefield who's ready to swing. You can't tell, but in my graveyard I have Dregscape Sliver, Leveler, and Thassa's Oracle ready. So I'm going to go to combat and swing Narfi at the opponent who doesn't have any blockers ready. As soon as they declare no blocks, I'm going to pay 2 mana to activate Covert Technician's Ninjutsu ability. Narfi's going to be bounced to my hand and Covert Technician is going to hit the battlefield. As soon as it connects, I can put Ashes of the Fallen directly onto the battlefield from my hand. As it enters, I'm going to choose the creature type Sliver. Now I'm going to go to main phase 2 and activate the Unearth ability of Dregscape Sliver. Next, I'm going to activate the Unearth ability of Leveler. As Leveler enters, it's going to exile all the cards remaining in my library. And next, all I have to do is pay the Unearth cost to bring Thassa's Oracle back from my graveyard to the battlefield. The game checks my library and sees that I have fewer cards remaining than I do blue mana symbols and permanents I control. And just like that, we're going to take the game. Keeping that combo in mind, I think it's important to address the fact that this is probably one of the jankiest decks I've ever made and probably one of the weakest. Don't bring this deck to a table if you actually want to win. But at the same time, what I enjoy about this deck is that it challenges you to be creative. It forces you to be comfortable with the activated abilities of cards that you you own because that's all you got. And I think learning to make do and survive with the limited resources you have is a good exercise as a Magic player. It forces you to play modestly with the meager resources you have in order to keep up and survive, but if you do that, it rewards you with a really satisfying victory. Not to mention the accolades that you can share that you won an entire game of Commander without ever casting a single spell. Or if you just really hate having your stuff countered every game, this might be the deck for you. The process of building this deck has actually been a really good exercise for me as a deck builder. One famous quote that I often reflect on is some variation of the saying, "Restriction breeds creativity." For example, the card Nexus of Fate is in this deck even though I have no intention of ever casting it. Its sole purpose in the deck is to prevent me from losing the game to an opponent's mill strategy without forcing me to shuffle my entire graveyard back into my library. With Nexus of Fate, I'll always have that one card in my library, which should hopefully set me up for the win. I also found some really interesting protection cards for my deck. Soul of New Phyrexia is a card that I'm very excited about in this deck. Again, I'm never going to be able to cast it, but for 5 colorless mana, I can give all of my permanents indestructible until end of turn. It's a great way to keep my stuff safe from non-exiling board wipes and even land destruction. Challenging yourself by limiting what you can and can't do forces you to analyze critically every single card in your deck to see their maximum potential, and that's a skill you're always going to be able to make use of as a deck builder and just as a Magic player. But that all being said, thank you so much for watching this video. It has been a while. And fun fact, this deck list was the one I planned to release 8 months ago. The one that I said was locked and loaded, and I'm glad I could finally get this done and share it with you. Next up on the list, I do have a short PDH video I want to make, so if you're interested in that format, stick around. And then in February, I want to make a video reflecting on the origins of this channel and some of the earliest videos I made. Just looking at how they held up, which decks I'm most proud of, and any new cards or mechanics that have come out recently that I think would make a good addition to that deck. Thank you again, and take care.